Hi, I'm Sheila Caldwell with the Johnson County Tourism Office. Today, I have a special treat for you. I am going to chat with Vickie Coleman of Bluegrass Quilt Appraisal. Now, Vickie is going to be the special presenter, as well as bringing an exhibit and having quilt talks with those that are attending the Shady Valley Festival of Quilts coming up on April the 11th and 12th over at Shady Rock School. You may remember last year they premiered this new event, and this year it is back bigger and better than ever. You are not going to believe all the great things they have going on those 2 days. So join me now. This is Vickie Coleman from Bluegrass Quilt Appraisal, which already I have like a gazillion questions just by the name of her company. But we want to welcome Vickie because she's going to be featured at the Shady Valley Festival of Quilts. Welcome, Vickie. It's nice to see you in person.
Thank you, Sheila. I'm happy to be here.
Great. Now, Bluegrass, does that mean you are from Kentucky by any chance?
Oh, yes. Beautiful Lexington, Kentucky. I like to say home of fast horses and beautiful women, not the other way around.
That could be a tourism slogan all by its itty bitty self. I'm going to have to remember that one. Well, thank you for joining me today. When I was talking to the folks over at Shady Rock School, specifically our mutual friend Tammy Love, she began telling me all about the plans for this year's Festival of Quilts. And how exciting, because as I've shared with you, around here in Northeast Tennessee, I think everybody, if you grow up in the South, it seems like most of us have a quilt that a distant relative has passed down, and it's passed down. And I'll just say, when you reach our age, it seems that you start inheriting things from your in-laws or your grandparents, your parents, and quilts are a big deal, in family heritage, and I might add in family lore, as I've learned from you in our conversations. But we're excited that you're going to be coming to the Festival of Quilts. But I just got to know, how did you get started in quilting to begin with?
Well, actually, I started quilting a long time ago. It was actually before my daughter was even born. She's now 37, and taking on the role of mom, that kind of went to the back burner for a while. And then when I was nearing retirement from teaching, I wanted to get back into it. Um, I remember when my dad retired, it's like he lost his identity. And I thought, I really need to find something that gives me joy. And my background's in textiles and clothing, and I have always gravitated toward anything dealing with textiles. And to me, the quilting really gave me that joy.
So is it something that you did with your mother or grandmother growing up?
Oh, bless her heart, my mother couldn't thread a needle.
Me neither.
So, yeah, so it sort of came about because of, honestly, in many ways, I'm going to show my age here. There was a major revival of all things handmade in the 70s, particularly around the bicentennial. And so that was really my first introduction into quilting. Now, my grandmother, my dad's mother, quilted. I think my mother inherited the non-sewing gene from her mother, but my grandmother had five boys. And we only lived near my grandparents when my dad was overseas because he was in the military. And I discovered that my grandmother had all these cool talents. She was a wonderful cook. She did tatting. She did quilting. She did all kinds of things. In fact, I have her sewing chair that we reupholstered three different times in my lifetime with her. Um, so that was kind of my introduction to it. And I wasn't all that excited about it. I was more excited about spending time with my grandmother. But I have to admit, over time, I kind of caught the bug of dealing with all things textiles to the point I ended up majoring in textiles and clothing.
How has that helped you? Because I understand you are a quilt appraiser. How did that help you in your current vocation?
Well, it typically takes about 5 years to become a certified quilt appraiser. It took me a little over 3 years, and I think the reason for that is because I had a leg up. I understood textiles and the different things about weaving, and I recognized fabrics by sight and knew the correct names and things like that. So it really did give me a leg up in terms of my journey into becoming a certified quilt appraiser.
And while you and I have had offsite discussions, we've talked about what you're going to be doing at the Festival of Quilts. And of course, you being a praiser, I understand you're going to be doing more consultations than appraising. Explain what the difference is between the two.
Oh, I'm happy to explain that because I get people all the time saying, I want to have my quilt appraised. And I said, well, what is your intent for this quilt? If it's for insurance, yes, you need to have it appraised because an appraisal is a legal document, just like having your house appraised. A consultation, I can tell you what you might want to know about this quilt. How old is it? What's the pattern name? Those kinds of things. And it's not a legal document, but it helps you make decisions. I probably do 9 consultations every one appraisal I do.
And I would guess there's always some fascinating stories, that come along with the quilts. It's kind of like watching Finding Your Roots. You may find out some stories that you thought were true because you've heard them since childhood, but not may necessarily be based on fact. So when you're looking at that quilt, what are some of the things that you notice right away that either dates the period that the quilt was made in, or maybe not lines up with family folklore?
Well, I'll give it to me what's the perfect example of that happened. I was helping doing a documentation day, which is gathering the information and put it into a database that we do here in Kentucky. And I had 2 tables. I said I was running 2 tables and I would work back and forth between them. And I looked at this quilt and I said, what date does the family have on that quilt? Because they fill out the information sheet. They said 1940. And I said, what's the family name? So I went out to the lobby. We were doing this at a church. And I said, may I please speak with, we'll say, Mrs. Jones. And this little tiny lady came up and I said, oh, honey, I'm not calling you to the principal's office. I just want to ask you a couple questions about your quilt. So we went back there and I said, um, I noticed you have a date of 1940 on your paperwork. This quilt's closer to 1840. And she went, what? And I said, and I need to ask you something else. I said, this is where the Tennessee and Kentucky girl came out at me. I said, where are your people from? I said, no, I'm talking about like the mid 1800s. She said, well, Northern Virginia. And I said, that makes sense because this quilt screams New York State to me. And it's not that far from the North Virginia border. And I said, so we're going to talk a little bit more about this quilt. I said, but this quilt is definitely not a Kentucky quilt. It is much further north than that. And what made me look at it was the style, the colors, and the fabrics. It was not a 20th century quilt. And so, yeah, it was about 1850.
I mean, I would be like, ah. I mean,
Oh,
that's
her niece
that's
who was with
huge.
her went almost bug-eyed, like, what? And I
Seriously.
said, I hope you have plans for this quilt. And I would seriously look at perhaps a historical society in the area where your family came from in the mid 1800s.
I think that would be like, Willy Wonka's golden ticket at that moment. It's like, you know and it's something that I know for people that when they're looking for appraisals, like you said, it might be insurance. Some might be looking for appraisals because they want to sell it. They may have something that they want to invest in, but for a lot of us that inherit those things, it's a piece of us. I mean, it's our family story. And I think one of the questions, I don't collect quilts, but I do collect books. So those things that you get that have that rare date to them, especially with quilts, I'm just thinking what I remember some of the quilts on my that my grandmother had in the farm in Virginia and things that I've seen like that. How do you go about, I mean, once you realize, you've inherited this treasure, right? How do you care for it? What do you do and what do you not do when somebody says, "Here, we want you to have your great great grandmother's quilt"? What should they know?
Well, if it is truly a vintage or antique quilt, I say think about where would you want to live in your house? Would you want to live in the damp basement, the overheated attic? No, you would not. So it needs to be in the same climate you'd be comfortable in. Quilts, textiles need to breathe. So you don't want to put them in a plastic bag in a cedar chest. A cedar chest is made for wool. So you want to not, first thing, take it out of the cedar chest. If you have no other option, what we suggest is to line the cedar chest. If you want to be real careful, you put aluminum foil in the bottom of it and a white sheet in it, and then you can put your quilt on top of the white sheet. I recommend also, if you can get it folded without too many creases, put it in a white pillowcase, then in the cedar chest with the white sheet, because it's the tannins in the wood that will break down the fibers of the cotton in the quilt.
And how many
So
years
that's,
we just shove things in that cedar chest thinking, well, that's where it belongs.
yes. Now, the only good thing was it kept it out of sunlight
Mhm.
because a lot of the dyes are not stable and being exposed to sunlight is not good for them. We didn't have a lot of real stable dyes in certain color ranges until some more modern. For example, we did not have a real stable green until the mid 1930s. Not a stable black until the 1880s. So a lot of what you think might be black in a quilt is actually dark brown, really dark brown or dark indigo. It just looks black, but it's not a true black. And you can tell it when you put it next to a true black. So a lot of those things were not color fast. And for example, red. Red was color fast, but it took 20 steps to make it 20 to make it color fast, which made it incredibly expensive. So chemists were always trying to develop a color fast red. Well, they developed a synthetic red. Unfortunately, it wasn't color fast. So a lot of those quilts, I have one. The green's not color fast, the red's not color fast. It's now two lovely shades of tan.
And as far as washing or taking it to the dry cleaners, making any
Well,
kind
number one,
of
almost stopped right there.
repairs.
Never take a quilt to a dry cleaner.
Oh, wow.
Never, ever, ever. There's never a good reason to take a quilt to a dry cleaner. A dry cleaner will submerge your quilt in chemical solvents. Not good for the quilt. As far as washing, I have a friend who says if you feel the urge to wash a quilt made pre 1930, lie down till that feeling passes.
I hear you. But you get
So,
those things and they have like maybe an old musty smell. Some of these quilts have been up in somebody's attic, possibly in a barn. It's just
well,
knowing what to do before you take
before
the
you do
step with
damage
it.
that can't
Yeah.
be undone, yes.
Yeah.
Well, the best thing for a musty smelling quilt is to let it air.
Mm.
I've gotten some quilts like that where I bought them at an online auction and opened the box and went, oh my word. They go out onto the covered porch
Out of the
and they'll air
sunlight.
out.
Yeah, out
Yeah.
of the sunlight. Yeah.
hmm
Well, those are
And
great
I've
tips. Yeah.
and I've had a quilt that had to stay out there a week before I could bring it in the house.
Oh boy.
But by the end of the week, it smelled like fresh air. So it just needed good airing.
Which they used to do. I mean, that was
Exactly.
beat them, air them, knock
Yes.
dirt off, all of that. So
hmm
that's awesome. Well, I know the people that are going to be going to the Shady Valley Festival of Quilts, which is coming up April 11th and the 12th over at Shady Rock School. They're going to see a lot of you that Friday
Yes, they
and
are.
Saturday. I'm delighted. So tell us what you're going to be doing while you're at the festival.
Well, we're going to be doing a bed turning. If you're not familiar with bed turning, people bring in their quilts. We're going to put them on, technically, it's not a bed. We've covered three tables and we're going to spread them out, but they're the size of a bed. And we're going to stack them up. And then as I like to call them, my volunteers, holders and folders, they're going to hold them up and I'm going to talk about that quilt. What do I see when I see this quilt? And I will have only had a few minutes with them prior to this. And then we'll show them, kind of like show and tell. They're going to be the showing and I'm doing the telling. And then we'll fold them up and give them back to their owner. And a lot of times it's for the purpose of, I want to know a little bit more about this quilt, but I only have a few minutes with each one of those quilts. So if you want more information, then you can see me at what I call my appraisal table, but we're really doing what I call quilt talks.
Mhm.
You bring it to me, I'll fill out a little bit of paperwork. Um, I'll spend about 30 minutes with you talking about the quilt because, for example, another example of why it's important to talk to someone who looks at your quilt and has the background. This woman told me that her grandmother had made this quilt. And I went, What's your grandmother's lifespan? And she told me, I said, do you think this quilt was made by a 7 to 11-year-old? She said, probably not. I said, here's what I believe may have happened. Your grandmother was given needle and thread by her mother and was asked to help. Put in a few stitches, a good way to occupy the child while you're working on your quilt. And great grandma may or may not have taken those stitches out after the little one went to bed. Don't know. Possibility, or she may have left them in there. And over the years, grandma was saying, I helped make this quilt, became I made this quilt.
Yeah.
And I said, so let's look at the lifespan for your great grandmother. And when we looked at it, the age of the quilt put the lifespan for the grandmother between about 30 and 45 years of age. So it was more likely that great grandma made this quilt.
Which to me would make it even more special.
Yes.
You
Well,
know,
it
'cause
was easier
that's
to date it that way. And I said, I do believe your grandmother helped make this quilt,
mhm.
but she probably did not make it on her own.
Wouldn't
Most
you love
11-year-olds didn't have that kind of skill.
wouldn't you love to go back and hear some of the conversations in those old quilting bees?
Oh, yes.
I'm sure
And
they had a lot of
I
fun.
always encourage people to write down as much information they have. And I said, even when you were told your grandmother made, it's okay to say family lore, Lore,
Yes.
indicates grandma blah 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 made this quilt. It's a possibility she helped her mother, name of the great grandmother, make this quilt. Name of both people, where they were living at the time, and the approximate date. And the best thing to do is you can write that on a piece of unbleached muslin.
Oh,
The best thing to do is get a piece of freezer paper, iron it on the back of the muslin, get an archival ink pen, which you can get at craft stores. Then you peel the paper off it after you write on it. The advantage of the paper, it gives you a firm surface to write your information. Peel the paper off, whip stitch it on the back of your quilt.
what a great tip.
And it will stay with the quilt. You don't have to worry about passing the story on. And I encourage new quilt makers to do the same thing. Label your quilt.
Absolutely. And just out of curiosity, say you're sitting there and I know most of the time the quilts probably will have more nostalgic value than intrinsic value, the ones that you see. But say somebody walks in with that rare gem and your eyes get big and your palms get sweaty, and it goes from being, just having a talk about the quilt. What would be the next steps for that person if you find that they have brought in something that is truly rare and valuable?
Well, I tell them that exactly, that this is an exceptional quilt and you should seriously consider having it insured. Because at this point in time, if something happened to that quilt, and honestly, there's no amount of money that will replace this heirloom, but it's not a bad idea to have it insured because that way, if something happened to it, you've got a record, photographs and so on and so forth. Talk to your insurance company. For most insurance companies, it's not going to increase your premium, but you've got documentation. If that quilt is destroyed, they're going to replace it the value of a blanket from Walmart or Target. And I tell people, I said, you cannot put a value on something that means that much to you, but unfortunately, insurance companies do. And so while we can't replace it, it might help ease the pain a little.
So that would require an appraisal,
An appraisal,
insurance,
yes.
right? What about how long does that kind of process take and what's involved?
Well, the consultation and appraisal are very similar in terms of the documentation that I get from it. You have to measure the size. I take a lot of photographs if it's an appraisal. And the reason I take a lot of photographs, when the appraisal report goes back to the owner, there are only 2 photographs on it. But in my file, I may have as many as 10. And the reason for that, thankfully, it's not happened to me. But if an insurance company disputes the claim, I might have to give a deposition on how I came up with that value. And so I'll pull up every one of those photographs and look at my notes. So I've got to be able to justify why I put that value on it. And an appraisal is much like a house. You have to look for comparable sales. And I follow online auctions. I know there are auction houses that do a lot of quilts, and I'll look at that. I look at, believe it or not, Facebook Marketplace, because that's usually the low end of what a quilt might get, but it also tells me what's selling and what's not. So that's how I go about doing appraisal. It takes some quilts take a little bit more research than others because it's hard to find some quilts that have sold in the last 12 months, and that's what we're supposed to base it on.
I understand you're also, among all of the other things that you're doing while you're at the festival, but you're also bringing a special exhibit. Tell us about that.
Well, yes, I am. I was asked to do an exhibit at the Lexington Public Library, and they told me I could do whatever I wanted. And I'm like, great, I want to do quilts of the 1930s. And it was called Fancy and Frugal Quilts of the Great Depression. And in this case, it was 18 quilts. It sort of started the seed for this project started with the quilt my grandmother made. Now, she did not make it in 1930s. She made it in 1969 because it was a gift for my sister who was born in 69, but it looks like a 1930s quilt. I love that quilt. It's a Dresden plate, and you're thinking, how did I get it from my sister? That's another story. She gave it to me, so that's okay. Um, but all the blades in the plate are 1960s fabrics, harvest gold and avocado green. It's a little jarring sometimes when you see it, but it definitely reflects the time in which it's made, which is very true for most quilts.
Mhm.
So I thought, okay, can I put that? No, that quilt did not go in the exhibit. I really focused on the 1930s because my grandmother learned to quilt in the 30s. And so even the quilt she made later on still looked like 30s quilts in terms of patterns and some nice color selection, but not always. So I started looking and I realized how many 1930s quilts I had in my own private collection to the point I had to narrow it down to 18.
Oh,
Narrow down to 18, yes. Um, and so I looked at the beginning of the 30s and trying to walk people through to the end of the 30s because you can definitely see the change, primarily in color palette, from the beginning of the 30s to the ends of the 30s. It went from very light, airy pastels to more intense colors, especially as we moved into the 40s. And then I did the research on each one of them, where the pattern originated. In this area, we see a lot of patterns that are Mountain Mist patterns because Mountain Mist is part of the Stearns and Foster Company out of Cincinnati. I'm only an hour south of Cincinnati. So I see a lot of 1930s Mountain Mist pattern quilts, a lot. So that's how it kind of originated. So when Miss Tammy and I talked about this, she wanted me to bring the exhibit with me. I said, well, I cannot bring all 18, but I can easily bring 12. So that's what I'm doing. And I'll be talking about quilts of the 1930s and their influences because, like fashion, quilts also are a reflection of the time in which they were made.
and speaking of the fancy and frugal quilt exhibit that you're bringing, you're actually going to be talking about those. So tell us a little bit more about that presentation.
Yes, I'll be doing that presentation both on Friday and Saturday. It's mainly talking about what influences the quilts from the 30s, and there's several things that do. And I have one quilt. It's really the only one that represents frugal. And I made the comment that in doing this, it dawned on me not everybody was affected by the Depression in the same way. So these quilts show that, but the one frugal quilt that I have in there really speaks to me. It's the color palette from the 30s. It's a lavender and yellow, and they are feed sacks. You can still see the printing of the feed sack front and back. And it's very frugal, but this person, and I'm going to assume a woman, was very careful. It's extremely well made, but it definitely is an example of her thrift and her frugality. And it was probably home dyed because the color's a little inconsistent. But it speaks to me. She wanted to do something special to beautify her space. And it's definitely my frugal quilt and it goes with me. And it's a southern quilt. One of the things I talk about is it's almost counterintuitive. Southern quilts are usually very thick and batting. And a lot of my northern friends will ask me, why do you think that is? I said, well, we don't have real extreme winters. You might only need one quilt. The rest of the year, it's a mattress pad.
Very true. Very
So
true.
you could, super thin quilts are usually northeastern because they just pile them on
And that particular person may have only had enough materials for that.
for that one. Yep.
I always love the story behind things. And I think that's, to me, it's the story, it's the relating it back to the people who made it. It's just the quilt in of itself is a beautiful piece of art, and
Mhm.
there's science behind it based on what you've shared when you talk about dyes,
Yeah.
when you talk about all of those things. But that story of the people, I'm sure that has to be a very enjoyable part of what you do is meeting the people and hearing their stories and helping them understand, what treasure they have in their
Oh,
possession
yes.
and how to care for it.
I've seen one other that I really am excited about. I Someone I know had inherited a farmhouse and obviously in all the outbuildings with it. And I was asked to come out there because she'd found over 30 quilts in the house, in the outbuildings, so on. And so I was looking at them and I said to her, I said, there's another bedroom across the hallway. Are there any quilts in there? And she goes, well, I think there might be one. We went over there and there were sheets, chenille bedspreads, boxes, uncovered them mostly. And I said, well, let me just take a peek at it. I pulled back the corner and I went, oh, internally. Externally, I went, this is a very lovely quilt. It's very old. She said, are you sure? I go, it predates the Civil War.
Wow,
And I use the Civil War as a marker because most people have in their mind when that occurred. Other dates don't necessarily mean as much. I go, oh, yeah, it's pre-Civil War by at least a couple decades. And so I shared it with someone else. We looked at it and 1835.
that's remarkable.
Yeah. And she thought it was a reproduction. I go, no.
I mean, when you think about some of the founding fathers were still alive
Oh,
in
yes.
35, it's
And
just that's crazy.
yeah,
That's
and
awesome.
I said, these look like English fabrics in here. And I shared it with someone who is, I say, the guru of antique fabrics. Said, oh yeah, those are definitely English fabrics, and they probably came through a southern port. And the comment was, how do you know? Well, because that time only Southerners matched their quilting thread to the motif on the top. So the blue parts were quilted with blue, the yellow parts were quilted with yellow, and said this probably came out of either Charleston or Savannah. So I went back to the person who owned the quilt and I said, shared that with her. And she goes, well, honey, I still have family in Savannah. And I said, well, I said, I know you have a family genealogist in your family there. I said, find out who was living in Savannah in the early 1800s and particularly about 1830 to about 1840. Probably a woman in her 30s or 40s. So find out who that is. I haven't talked with her recently, but I'm very excited about that quilt. It's the most amazing quilt I've ever seen up close and personal.
That is awesome. And I can't wait to hear the stories that you are going to hear when you join over at the Shady Valley Festival of Quilts, April the 11th and 12th. Vickie, thank you so much for joining me today. We're going to talk a little bit here about the event and let everybody know what's coming up. So, we have the Shady Valley Festival of Quilts, April 11th and 12th. That is a Friday and a Saturday. It's going to go from 10 a.m. until 4 p.m. Vickie Coleman is going to be there both days. Both days will feature all of the programming that we've just talked about, the presentations. So if you come Friday, not Saturday, Saturday, not, you're not going to miss a thing. And if you want to come back and come both days, they would love it. There's going to be a whole lot of fun those 2 days. A judged quilt show, the Quilts of Valor Awards, like they had last year. There will be vendors, scissor sharpening. Oh my gosh, who doesn't need that from time to time? Lots of door prizes. They will have the Shady Rock School Cafe open, and I can tell you they always serve really wonderful foods and items there. There's going to be some quilt classes. You're going to need to register in advance for those. Admission is only $10. You're going to get a whole day of this for $10. Veterans and children under the age of 12 are actually free. And so you don't want to miss an opportunity. And I want to throw out there, because you guys know I'm all about supporting our local nonprofits and our community organizations. The proceeds from this Festival of Quilts helps sustain the Shady Rock School. So when you go, not only are you going to have a lot of fun, learn a lot, experience things you never even thought about when it comes to the beautiful world of quilting, but you're also going to be helping the Shady Rock School. So take the whole family. This is something that your children, your grandchildren, you want to expose them to. So we want to encourage you to go out. Go to visit mountaincitytn.com. Right on the home page, we will have this video as well as a lot more information about the event, and we hope to see you there. Have a great day.